here we go. All right, everybody, let me know with a thumbs up if you can see me out there, along with one of the most famous BKs in the universe, and that is not me, Brian Keating, but that's Bernardo Kastrup, who is joining us all the way from the Netherlands, who makes him, I think the Netherlands are my second most popular country, Bernardo.
Oh,
In terms of guests,
could
I've
very
had
well be.
I just had on Guido Imbens, and I had on more recently Heiko Falke, many other Dutchmen. I haven't had any Dutch women on, but hopefully I'll get some Dutch women too. But I have a particular fascination with the Dutch because they invented this device here, which we're going to talk
Oh,
about,
yes.
which is
And the microscope as well. Don't
and the
get the credit
microscope.
on that.
And I think the first name of the person who invented both of them, or part of the name had Hans in it, Hans Leeuwenhoek and then Hans Lippershey. Although I think Leeuwenhoek had a different other major name. Anyway, I don't know. I should be.
You could have up to 4 given names in the Netherlands. Very common.
Is that real? Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
And Hans is Johannes.
Yes. Oh, that's right. Yes, it's just a short for that.
Nobody says Johannes. Nobody.
And then
not one person.
and then their Germany is Hansa, right? Or Hans. The Lufthansa is German Airlines, right? So, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. First, I have to acknowledge our interlocutor who set all this up, and that is none other than Kurt J. Mungle of the Theories of Everything podcast. I should have pinged him that you'd be on. Maybe I'll direct message him once we get going here. But it's a great treat to have you on the podcast. And it's sorry it's taken so long. We've gone back and forth. We had COVID, etc. But I'm so glad you're here, Bernardo. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Brian.
And so I want to start just very quickly for those very few people that may not know who you are. You are a Ph.D. And you have Ph.D. in computer engineering, but you've also done significant Ph.D. work in philosophy, in particular ontology, which we'll talk about. You've worked in particle physics institutions like CERN and Philips Research Laboratories, and he's worked on many popularizations for the general audience. You've done a lot of videos, including with past guest Sabina Hossenfelder. Maybe we'll get into that. And then hosted by my friend Kurt. So it's really quite a great honor to meet you and be together finally on the phone. I know it's late there, but we have a lot to cover. So the first thing I want to cover actually does relate not to the telescope's inventor, but the telescope's primary user, at least initially, and that's this guy here, Galileo Galilei. Who said something I want you to react to. He said, the job of a scientist is to measure what's measurable and make measurable what is not so, i.e., to build instruments, to build tools, sometimes to build mental models. I want to ask you, to what extent is it really even possible or useful to build all these tools? Are there certain tools that are more useful than others? And your take on what Galileo said. Is that the primary aim of science, to measure what's measurable?
I would say the primary aim of science is to predict what's going to happen next. And measurement is a way to refine our models so we can predict more accurately. Maybe I have too much a pragmatic view of science. But yeah, this thing was inculcated in me since I was very young. I landed at CERN at 22. That was my first job. So the notion of measurement is directly coupled to the ability for one to develop a predictive model and tell what's going to happen next before it happens. So for me, that's the core of science.
So I wanted to ask you about the kind of maybe conflicts, or maybe you could comment on the work of, in particular, Donald Hoffman. When I think about you, I think about different analogies for consciousness. And I've come to the feeling that it's almost hopeless. I've had on David Chalmers and the coiner of the hard problem of consciousness. I want to ask you, where does a professional kind of feel that this notion of either consciousness as a possibility within the scientific enterprise? First of all, is there a role for science in consciousness? Let me ask you that to begin with.
There clearly is a role for a science of the contents of consciousness, I think, because they are our primary interface to reality. What you are never conscious of, directly or indirectly, might as well not exist. Now, a science of consciousness, in the sense of trying to reduce consciousness, trying to explain consciousness in terms of something else that isn't consciousness itself, that I think is hopeless, because we cannot play the reductive game forever. We cannot keep on reducing one thing to another forever unless we engage in circular reasoning. So at some point, we hit sort of the bottom level of reality. And we can then explain everything else in terms of that ontological primitive that we find at the end, but we can't explain the ontological primitive itself. And that's inevitable. Whatever one's theory of nature is, you have to come down to at least one ontological primitive. And I think consciousness is it. I think we can make sense of everything else in terms of consciousness, but we cannot reduce consciousness, awareness, phenomenality itself to something else. And the attempt to do that, I think, is hopeless and leads to the signs of internal contradictions that we refer to as the hard problem of consciousness, for instance.
And again, that calls back to Galileo, which I think Philip Goff, who's a past guest on the podcast as well, spoke about Galileo's error, which was, as far as I understand it, yeah, this primitive notion of the hard problem in the context of, can something inside the medicine bottle ever really read what's on the outside label? And I do feel like there is an incredible, gap between what we do work on in actual, sort of proper scientific reasoning with instruments and so forth, and reproducibility. It seems almost impossible to think, though, that we could ever reproduce or have a control group with consciousness. And that, I think, leads many people to think about maybe philosophically entertaining, but ultimately, impractical sorts of experiments. I mean, are you aware of any, true experiments that could shed a light, no pun intended, on consciousness as other than, kind of metaphorically, the dashboard, the instrument panel of yours, etc.? Are there only Gedanken experiments, or can we actually do real, honest to goodness experiments in the physical sciences?
I think we can. I think neuroscience has been showing that experimentation around awareness, phenomenality, consciousness itself is possible and it's productive to a large degree. The entire field of the neuroscience of consciousness, the notion of the neurocorrelates of consciousness, is based on measurement and subjective reports, individuals who report what they are experiencing. Now, are there problems with that? Are there limitations? Surely there are. For instance, when you are basing your study on reportability, you do not distinguish between raw consciousness or phenomenal consciousness, as we say it, on the one hand, and on the other hand, meta consciousness or, or, or conscious metacognition, which goes on top of awareness. It's consciousness is what you have when, in addition to experiencing, you know that you experience.
Mm.
Now, to report an experience, you have to be meta conscious of it. Otherwise, you will say, well, I'm not having that experience. Well, in fact, you may be experiencing it. So
Right.
there is that limitation. The neuroscientists today try to get around that with the so-called no report paradigms, but then you get limited in all kinds of other ways. But I think it is productive to have some science around phenomenality, around consciousness. What we will not succeed, and unfortunately, that seems to be the goal for most sciences around consciousness, is to reduce consciousness to physiological brain activity, to neurometabolism. The very attempt to do that presupposes a certain metaphysical assumption, which is that, well, consciousness is reducible and that the correlation between brain activity and consciousness is a causal one. And that I think is hopeless. Um, and to complement the neuroscience of consciousness, I think the way to go is to have introspective investigation, which is not science. We should not add introspection to science because it will break the back of science's horse, and we will lose a very, very useful horse that we should keep and protect and maintain healthy. But in addition to science, I think it would be very productive, even for the scientists who practice the science of consciousness, to develop a little more sophisticated introspective awareness, to know a little bit more firsthand what it is that they are actually studying.
Mm.
Because the level of introspective naivete amongst philosophers of mind and neuroscientists of consciousness is sometimes scary. It's
How so?
sobering.
Because why? Why do you say that?
Well, because one is dedicating one's life to studying consciousness, which can
Mm.
only be actually known from introspection, a first-person perspective. But one is extremely naive about what that word means. So how can one study it from the outside if one doesn't actually know what one is studying? I mean, there are attempts made by famous neuroscientists who say that, and I quote, consciousness doesn't happen, consciousness doesn't exist. And when you read their material, what you realize is that what they call consciousness is a kind of ethereal sense of individual subjectivity, a kind of individual I within, a kind of soul or spirit.
Hmm.
And that's what they explain away. Well, very good. It's not like anybody was waiting for, for that kind of proof of the obvious, but they confuse that with what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, which has nothing to do with individual identity or some kind of individual soul. It's about experience itself, phenomenality. It's a type of existence that is defined in terms of qualities as opposed to quantities. You cannot specify or fully describe experiences on the basis of physical quantities. What is the length in centimeters of a thought? What is the weight in kilograms of an emotion? What is the color of a memory? I mean, uh, that's where things go wrong when a you know otherwise famous neuroscientist makes proclamations about the ability to reduce consciousness to nothing, while in fact what he's referring to as consciousness is not is not consciousness at all. I think that is unfortunate, and a little more introspective insight would improve and help everybody to engage in a more productive dialogue.
Mm. So I think it is useful to kind of maybe for the audience to kind of state some of your positions, which I'll summarize at least as I understand them. But please correct me if I'm wrong in the likely scenario that I'm wrong. But as far as I understand it, you are not, although you are materialistic in some sense, you don't believe that computers will ever be able to approach the conscious experience or even the thought process that humans can engage in. Is that correct? Am I summarizing your position or
Mm, I'm not a materialist,
okay? Hmm.
not at all. I don't think that the foundational level of nature is material or physical or describable in terms of quantities at all. I don't think that is true. I am very skeptical of the notion that one can build a silicon computer and expect it to have private conscious inner life the way you and I have. Because when we talk about conscious computers, what we mean is more than just the fact that there is consciousness associated with it.
Mm,
What we mean is that a computer would be conscious in the same way as you and I are. In other words, a computer would have private conscious states that are accessible from the inside but not from the outside.
yes.
That, I think, is a very unproductive fantasy.
Hmm.
It arises from some silly psychology because nature is telling us that what private conscious inner life looks like when observed from the outside is warm, moist neurochemistry. That's what it looks like. So why would a silicon computer that doesn't metabolize, doesn't burn ATP, doesn't release neurotransmitter molecules, doesn't have action potentials? Well, you can imitate action potential, so that's not a good example, but doesn't have any of the rest. Why would that be what private conscious inner life looks like? It's completely arbitrary. The
Mm,
mistake made here is to mistake a simulation for the thing simulated. We don't make that mistake for anything else. I mean, nobody would mistake a kidney function simulation on a computer for a kidney producing urine. Nobody would expect a computer to pee on one's desk because one knows that a kidney simulation, even if accurate down to the molecular level, is not the thing simulated. But when it comes to the patterns of mental activity in a human being, we think the simulation is the thing simulated, and that's extraordinarily naive. No, I don't think any
Mhm.
silicon computer will ever have private conscious in their life.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying. A lot of the problems that I have with things that are controversial, like predicting future climate change, neglect the fact that no simulation really is capable of capturing the complexity in a complex system, not just a complicated system, but a complex system like the weather on planet Earth. You know, the only computer that can do that, it seems, is the Earth itself. And that's not very useful if you have you have to build a planet-sized computer to do a simulation of that very planet. But I do maybe push back on one thing that I think that quantum computers are very, very good at simulating the properties of quantum computers. You know, it's almost recursive that they can simulate Lagrangians, and they can understand. They can actually quite sufficiently calculate future behaviors of to within the realms of uncertainty. But that might be the only case, and that may be the only not only the only instance of a simulation that accurately simulates something that it was intended to simulate, but that may be the only good thing that they can do besides maybe breaking quantum codes of some spies or something like that. But yes, I do agree, and but that's where to be honest, it feels hopeless. I'm just a simple experimentalist. I build telescopes. We analyze the telescope data. It's highly processed. But I've had conversations with many philosophers, including the guests that I mentioned earlier, and it always comes down to this recursion of infinite turtles kind of all the way down. Whereas we kind of know consciousness when we see it. And I guess my question to you is that if we have a this evolutionary propensity to develop consciousness, as you I believe, but always correct me if I'm wrong, Bernardo, because I may have gotten this wrong in all the preparation I was doing. But I believe that you believe that evolution, has kind of provided a mechanism by which the experience of consciousness that we perceive has taken place. And I know that Donald Hoffman has this desktop interface modality in which he has an analogy for how we perceive it. But both of those are kind of driven by Darwinian evolutionary mandates. But I wonder, what isn't there a kind of a disconnect, because we don't see animals, conscious in exactly the same way, even though they've been evolving. We've had 50,000 generations of certain E. coli strands. They don't seem to exhibit consciousness as far as we can tell. Or is that just a bias that I have as a human being, that my consciousness is better than an electron's, panpsychic consciousness? Am I wrong? Shouldn't we expect to see, if evolution really does drive, why is there only one species of one primate, of all the different primates, of all the millions of species, why is there only one that exhibits plausible notion of what we call consciousness?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, sorry.
So I'll take various departing points.
Take your time.
If you study microscopic life closely, I think you would be amazed how many signs of private conscious inner life single cellular organisms manifest. You can watch amoeba single celled organisms building little vases, little houses out of mud particles they pick from the bottom of the puddle where they live. And then they enter it and they live in there. You can watch paramecium go after food and navigate what is essentially a labyrinth, going after food, running away from threats. Um, it is baffling if you observe carefully how many signs of conscious inner life, essentially all life, manifests. And they all metabolize like we do. They all do protein folding, transcription, ATP burning. ATP burning, not all of them, but they share many of the fundamental traits of life that we have. So I would uh, dispute the premise of your question
Hmm.
that only highly evolved animals, like maybe primates and pachyderms and cetaceans, exhibit signs of conscious inner life. Many animals, for instance, corvidians, they express a sorrow. They do little rituals around their fallen comrades. Um, I live with 3 cats. I have had animals all my life. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that they have conscious in their life. Now, I don't think consciousness itself has evolved. I think consciousness as an ontological category, as a type of existent, is where it all begins from. It's what is there from the get go. So it didn't evolve. I think what evolved are dissociated complexes of a field of raw phenomenal consciousness that spans the entirety of nature. And what those dissociated complexes look like is what we call biology, is what we call life. And then the inner mental complexity of these dissociated processes that evolved as well. And these organisms evolved over time higher level mental functions that were not there in nature in the beginning. For instance, what we just talked about, metacognition, self awareness. These are things that have evolved within life, within dissociated complexes of primary consciousness, so to say. But consciousness as an ontological category was there from the beginning. And there I am with Professor Donald Hoffman. We both think that consciousness was there from the beginning, but the contents of consciousness or the specific configuration of consciousness that has evolved over time because of fitness criteria entailed by our ecosystem.
How could you distinguish that type of collective behavior? As physicist Philip Anderson said, more is different. He didn't say necessarily that, more is better, more is worse. He said it's different. In other words, the collective behavior of a pile of grains of sand is very different than 100 million times one grain of sand's behavior. When we have emergent phenomena that comes up. Again, I mean, to push back, I mean, couldn't you say then that sand grains are conscious? I mean, in the panpsychic sense, it seems to me that there could be, well, when they get too heavy and they have too much, at risk to the sand grain colony. I'm just making this up. Please humor me. Then they collapse, and that's good for the, it's like a colony of bees collapsing, because sometimes you need to have a new genetic strand that kills off the bat. Anyway, I'm making all this up, but I mean, who are we? Aren't we applying a selective filter to the definition of consciousness that's not necessarily, intrinsic to it? The famous "the map is not the territory." I hate that phrase, because I actually have some territory that's a map, and I say the map is the territory. I'm just kidding. But could you not say the similar things, although much weaker, about grains of sand, even eukaryotic life forms, and perhaps electrons themselves? I mean, this is getting into panpsychism, so maybe you could say something about your thoughts on panpsychism.
Um, Contrary to living organisms that do manifest behaviors that are very suggestive of their being correlated with conscious inner life, I don't think grains of sand manifest any behavior that would suggest that they are conscious. Um, you alluded to Anderson, and more is different. Um, I don't think Anderson was defending some kind of how to say, strong emergence.
Mm,
I think what he was highlighting is that there may be fundamental organizing principles in nature
mm,
that kick in only when systems pass a certain threshold of complexity. Because why would all the laws of physics manifest only at the microscopic level? There may be organizing principles that kick in at higher levels. And there is some suggestive evidence in science that certain behaviors of nature cannot be reduced to first principles at the microscopic level. So
mm,
that's how I would interpret that, but I wouldn't interpret that at all as a defense of consciousness as some kind of strongly emergent property, because I don't think that's there at all. Regarding panpsychism, I'm very critical of it.
mm-hmm,
You see, I think there are many errors they make, but one way to frame the error is to confuse the structure of what is perceived for the structure of the perceiver. If you, I'll repeat it so it
mm-hmm,
sinks in. Panpsychists confuse the structure of what is perceived with the structure of the perceiver. And the thought goes like this. If I look at an organism, it's made of parts. It's made of cells. Those cells are made of molecules. And I, as the observer, I have a body like that, also made of cells. Therefore, my mind should be made of parts and should be constituted of some kind of microscopic sea of consciousnesses that come together in my brain. Well, that is mistaking the structure of what is perceived for the structure of the perceiver. I think there are many reasons why panpsychism is untenable. One is logical. You cannot have a explicit and logical account for how micro level subjectivities can combine to form a higher level, seemingly unitary subjectivity, such as my inner life of your inner life. Another reason, and you're a physicist, that will come closer to home for you. I think panpsychism is physically incoherent because panpsychists take elementary subatomic particles to be little beads. But we have known since at least Feynman in the 40s and quantum electrodynamics that that's not what elementary subatomic particles are. They can't be like that. Otherwise, we cannot account for quantum fluctuations. That there are so many things we cannot account even for the interactions of particles, because particle interactions are not given to us by quantum theory. They're given to us only by quantum field theory. And under quantum field theory, particles are ripples of quantum fields, which are
Right.
themselves spatially unbound and span the whole of nature. So panpsychism assumes that particles are little beads, while we have known, arguably, since the 1920s. I know some physicists would say, no, 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 you're full of shit. It's since the 1940s. Don't take away this prize from Feynman. Fine. Since the 1940s, we have known that that's not what particles are. So
Right.
yeah, no, it's a hopeless
Yeah,
ontology, I think.
I agree. And to those who say that the hard problem is really a superposition of many easier problems, which maybe you were hinting at some level, just the filtration effect. What do you make of those claims? Dennett and others have said that the hard problem it's really just a bunch of it's like the strong anthropic principle. Maybe that's just a bunch of weak anthropic principles superimposed. What do you make of Dennett's claim that the hard problem it's really not? It's a misnomer.
What Dennett tries to do is fundamentally incoherent because he never closes his line of argument. He acknowledges that, so let's not blame him for that. He's the first one to say, yes, I haven't closed my line of argument. But if we pay attention to how his argument unfolds, what he does is he's saying many of the contents of consciousness actually do not correspond to objective states of affairs in the world. In other words, we have illusions. We mistake things for other things. We think we are experiencing certain things that exist out there, and it turns out our experiences were illusory. Those things were not out there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we extrapolate that line of argument, and I will even grant that for the sake of argument, let's say that everything is an illusion. Let's say that all of our experiences do not correspond to objective states of affairs in the world, that our entire lives, everything we take to be true, is in fact an illusion, that we are fooling ourselves. Does that prove that consciousness is not there? Or does that prove that consciousness is everything? Because illusions are experienced. There is nothing to an illusion by definition other than the experience of it, because that experience doesn't correspond to objective states of affairs in the world. So all you have is the experience. That's what an illusion is. It's a pure experience.
Mm.
So by arguing that all the contents of consciousness are illusory, what we are actually saying is that always in consciousness and only in consciousness, we will never manage to pull out of this argument like a magician pulling a rabbit, or a rabbit out of a hat, that there is no consciousness, because consciousness is that within which all those illusions unfold.
Mm.
So no, Dennett's attempt is fundamentally flawed and has been so since at least 1991.
Mm. Now, another person that who hasn't conceded any ground, at least to my knowledge, to your criticisms of her work, is past guest in front of the show, Sabine Hossenfelder. Many of her channel audiences subscribes to this channel and are probably listening right now. So you wrote an article back in earlier this year called "The Fantasy Behind Sabine Hossenfelder's Superdeterminism." And then you had a debate with my good friend Kurt Jaimungal as the mediator, moderator, however you want to call it. I personally think debates are almost pointless, but because very few people come away changed from their original perspective, they get reified and more sunk cost into their original philosophy. But first, would you mind describing the notion of superdeterminism and perhaps steel manning, or in this case, steel womaning Sabina's position, and why she believes what she believes, what's accurate about that, and then why you guys have this continuing kind of friendly but dispute nonetheless. So first of all, what is superdeterminism in your mind? What does it mean to you? What's wrong with it? And then what's right about Sabina's interpretation as a steel womaning attempt?
Yeah.
A lot there.
I will still woman it
Yes.
because a lot of people do present superdeterminism in a way that is not what Sabine is trying to get to put forward. Some people confuse superdeterminism, for instance, with an argument against free will, and that goes way further than it needs to go for superdeterminism to make some sense. The claim is the following. In experiments with entangled particles, we know statistically now, and this has won the Nobel Prize in Physics this year, after
Mm,
40 years of experimental confirmation,
that's
we
right.
know that the physical properties that we measure on a particle, the properties that define what the particle is, the properties that define physicality, such as angular momentum, which is a popular one in this kind of experiments, those properties are a function of the experimental setup. In other words, what you see about a particle depends on what you choose to measure about another particle entangled with the first one. So the particles don't seem to have a priori physical properties. Their physical properties seem to arise from measurement. And it seems to be that the act of measurement is what brings physicality into existence, which I think is correct, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in an attempt to try to save physicality, to say, no, there were physical particles there before, if you say that, then you have to explain why everything unfolds as if the act of measurement determined the physical properties. And the way to go about it in superdeterminism is to say that there are hidden variables in the particles and the detectors that establish a causal chain in the act of measurement, whereby the setup of the measurement apparatus causally changes the particle in a non-local way, or even, it would have to be a non-local way. Now, why do I think this is baloney? Why do I think this is a fantasy? For a number of reasons. One of them is to try to bring the assumptions that have to be made at the microscopic level, try to bring them into a level that we can relate to with our intuition. What superdeterminism requires is equivalent to the following. Suppose you take your camera and you want to photograph the moon at night, and then you set your aperture and you set your exposure time in your camera and you point the camera to the moon and you photograph it. What superdeterminism would say in this analogy is that what the moon is, the physical properties of the moon, such as its perimeter, its mass, whatever, are a function of the aperture and the exposure time in your camera. So if you would set your camera differently to a different aperture, a different exposure time, then the moon would be different. That's what is
Mm-hmm.
required. I think that is not intuitive. It's a rather extraordinary hypothesis. But to make it worse, there isn't even the beginning of a theoretical account of what the necessary hidden variables might be. Sabine and nobody else is telling us what the hidden variables are. And that's the core of physics. I mean, that's how physics is done. When Peter Higgs first proposed the Higgs boson back in the 60s, he gave us a fairly complete characterization. He told us, I expect it to be found in this energy range. I expect it to decay in this and this particles because nobody has ever measured the Higgs directly. It decays before it interacts with any measurement surface. So you have to know what it decays into in order to reconstruct the event and be able to say there was a Higgs in there. He also told us coherently how the Higgs boson plays its role, how it leads to inertia. In other words, to mass by means of the Higgs field, that sticky field that prevents things from moving at the speed of light all the time. So we had a complete map of what to look for when we started looking for it back in 1994. And I know because I was there when the Atlas experiment was proposed and approved. We knew what we were looking for. We knew where to look and how to look. But there is no such a thing for the hidden variables of superdeterminism. They are just a placeholder. And as such, an expression of faith. The faith is there has to be something, God knows what, that does God knows how, what needs to be done for us to be able to hold on to our prejudice that physical entities have standalone existence and are not epiphenomenal. I don't think that's good science. And in that debate, Sabine told to my face that she had determined what the hidden variables are, that she had published a paper saying what the hidden variables are. And when I looked at the paper, it was a toy model. In other words, those were the hidden variables of a fantasy universe, not hidden variables that are plausible or tenable in any way in this universe. So no, the hidden variables are just a placeholder for fantasies and wishful thinking as of this time. And to her credit, she did propose one experiment that in principle doesn't need the hidden variables to be determined in advance. It doesn't matter what they are, the experiment could produce a relevant outcome either way. The problem is, and I don't know how much detail you want to get here, that experiment is non-falsifiable. In other words, because we don't know what the hidden variables are, once the experiment produces a negative result, you can always say, well, it just is not accurate enough. We didn't repeat the measurement fast
Right.
enough to account for entropy or anything else.
Or
So
noise.
it will never be a conclusive experiment because it cannot falsify the hypothesis that motivated it to begin with. So I don't think that's productive either.
Mm-hmm. When I have talked with others in the past, including Chalmers and Philip Goff, I've proposed this notion of kind of the Drake equation for determining consciousness. But of course, with the Drake equation, it's not really an equation; it's just some kind of parameterization, perhaps. But the biggest claim to fame that it has is it's very well known. It's very frequently described, and I think there's sort of a necessity for that to have to both clearly understand that we apply a filter no matter what we're doing as measuring devices or as entities. We are applying our prejudices, our biases, etc., that we have to be on guard against. And I think most people don't really think about it in those notions that when we say the Drake equation, I mean, we're not looking at, well, there could be life, in 19 dimensions. That doesn't appear in the product of terms, right? So there's always a kind of hidden assumptions that go into it. Maybe not hidden in the sense of hidden variables necessarily, but I think it is important to realize that we have these biases. And I wonder, I always say with the Drake equation, it's sort of, not even, again, it's not even wrong. It's not even an equation. But the most important parts of it, to whatever extent it's useful, would be the error analysis. Like you as a scientist, you and I, we know we don't just quote the average of something, some number of something. We quote the error bars. And it's the error bars that are much, much harder to obtain than the central value. I mean, the Higgs, at the mass that you mentioned, 125 GeV, that's not the interesting thing. It's the errors that go into the measurement of that are so important. So I wonder if we're not also kind of making a mistake when we think about these tests, so to speak, that we are applying our prejudices, and we have to be very much on guard, as Feynman said, against fooling ourselves. I think one of the easiest ways to fool ourselves is to ignore the fact that we are participating in this event itself. So you don't necessarily have to respond to that, but I'm wondering, is there a way that is there a framework that we could address, like a Drake equation? At least it's convenient, it's popular, whatever. But is there a way that we could, perhaps learn to parameterize our ignorance of what is conscious or what is not conscious? Is there some kind of framework that's mechanized or that you could recommend, or is it really ad hoc and we kind of have to make it up as we go along?
No, I don't think it's ad hoc. I think if we pay attention to nature, nature gives us the hints. I think if you
Mm,
look at the behavior of the different entities in nature, it's pretty clear that the ones that give us signs that we can relate to as conscious entities, that those other entities are also conscious, uh, consistently are entities that have what we call metabolism. Look, the variety of life is almost unimaginable. Organisms can be so comprehensively different that it's hard to find any common thing across different varieties of life. But there is one very clear common thing, which is
mm,
all life metabolizes. If you zoom in with a microscope at a sufficiently large degree of magnitude, you will see that all that seeming diversity boils down to commonality. Even archaea have those commonalities. By the way, we may be archaea, it turns out, but
mm,
that's another whole other thing. All life has those characteristics, which are not trivial. They are incredibly complex. They are very, very, very distinct. None of it can be considered casual. For instance, protein folding, we don't know how to solve that computationally to this day, and your body does it in like 1 or 2 seconds. And ATP burning and transcription. I mean, these are amazingly sophisticated, non-trivial things that unify our life. So I would say if we pay attention to that with an open mind, pay attention to nature with an open mind, what we have reasons to consider conscious entities are living entities. Rocks don't give us reason to think that. Uh, 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 um, Minerals in general. Some would say, well, stars, if you look at the patterns of uh, the electromagnetic fields in stars, they are similar to organic brains. Maybe, but then you have to abstract away the fact that the substrate is completely different, the fact that the physical regimen is completely different. What's happening in the stars, that's plasma regimen. That's completely different from the 37 degrees in which stuff is happening in our brains. You have to ignore size.
mhm.
You have to ignore so many things to make that leap, which I think, look, it, as you know from science, science is not about what we can prove not to be the case,
Right.
because the vast majority of things cannot be unproven. I cannot prove that there isn't a flying spaghetti monster. I cannot prove that there isn't a teapot in the orbit of Saturn right now, because maybe aliens came here in the 19th century, stole one, and dumped it on their way back home, and it got caught by Saturn. A great many silly things cannot be unproven.
Of
So
course.
the important question to ask is not what we can disprove. The important question to ask is, what do we have reasons to seriously entertain as a hypothesis? And I submit to you that the only things we have reason to seriously entertain the hypothesis that they have private consciousness in a life of their own are living things that
Mm.
metabolize, which excludes even viruses.
Yeah, it excludes the panpsychic approach, right? So I
Yeah.
want to reset just for people that are tuning in. We've got over 109 people that are watching live, and many, many hundreds more, thousands more will watch later. Talking with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He's in the Netherlands now, the lower regions of the lower regions, and it's great to have him on. I've wanted to have him on many, many times. Thanks to Kurt Jaimungal for making the shidduch, the introduction between the two of us. We've had on many, many great guests in the past talking about different aspects of consciousness, of positivism, of materialism, ranging from our earlier conversation that we mentioned, David Chalmers and Philip Goff, to more recently the conversation that we had with Nick Bostrom, and then even more recently, a conversation we had with Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose. And I want to get your reaction to both of those. First, let's turn towards, it's like you can't have a conversation as a podcaster now, Bernardo, without talking about Bitcoin or aliens, or the simulation hypothesis. So what is the simulation hypothesis, and how do you react to it? As productive, or is it counterproductive to the project that you're embarking on?
It depends on what people mean by it, because people mean so many different things when they talk about the simulation hypothesis. I'll start with one possible meaning that I think is completely useless, downright silly, which is the notion that our physical universe and even our consciousness as conscious beings are the product of some simulation run in a physical computer, in some kind of meta universe, our universe being the result of that simulation in some other computer of some other civilization. Why do I think this is useless? Because it doesn't solve any problem, it just postpones the problem. It says, well, our metaphysical problem is solved because then now we can say our world is just simulated. It's simulated in that meta universe. Yeah, but what is then the ontological nature of that meta universe? You just postponed the problem. You just moved it away without giving any solution whatsoever. And the price of moving it away is by entertaining a hypothesis for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence, none whatsoever. So you just add stuff. That's the clearest violation of Occam's razor of the principle of parsimony that one could think of, except for the multi-universe. The anyway, I'll not get into that. Now, is there a charitable way to interpret the simulation hypothesis in a manner that makes it useful or productive? Yes, but if you understand it, you would probably not call it a simulation hypothesis. The interpretation would be the following. The physical world we see around us is not the world as it is in itself. It is just how the world as it is in itself presents itself to us. Physicality is not the thing in itself. Physicality is a representation, probably our own cognitive representation. It's an appearance. Donald Hoffman would call it a virtual reality headset. I would call it a dashboard of instruments. Physicality is what appear on our dashboard of instruments when we make measurements on the world in order to navigate our environment. Just like the airplane's sensors make measurements of the sky outside, and the results of those measurements are displayed on the dashboard. The dashboard conveys important and accurate information about what's going on in the world as it is in itself, in the sky outside. So much so that you can fly purely by instruments. You can land your plane safely without even ever looking through the window, even if the airplane didn't have windows. The mistake we make is that we take the dashboard for the sky outside, because the screen of perception is our dashboard. Our sense organs are sensors. They make measurements on the world. Those measurements are presented to us in the form of the colors we see, the sounds we hear, the scents we smell, textures we feel, the flavors we taste. These are our dashboard dials, so to say. And they convey important and accurate information about the world. If you ignore them, you will walk under a truck. So we should take the dashboard seriously, but not literally. What we think is that the dashboard is the world, that the physical world is the world as it is in itself, even though that leads to all kinds of problems in foundations of physics and philosophy. We insist on that transposition. Um, if you interpret the simulation hypothesis to mean that the physical world is just an appearance, then I would say, yes, that's productive, but I wouldn't call it a simulation, because a simulation seems to suggest that it is how to say, a premeditated thing that some intelligent organism set up just to deceive us. I don't think that's going on. That's what's going on at all. I mean, early on, you thought I was a materialist, and I corrected you. I'm not a materialist. What I am, and that's probably what misled you, I am a reductionist and I am a naturalist. In other words, I think we should explain one thing in terms of another until we are left with only one thing in our reduction base, in terms of which we can explain everything else. And I think nature unfolds spontaneously in the naturalist sense. I think nature does what it does because it is what it is, not because it has some kind of skewed, devious plan to deceive us. I don't think that's what's going on. I mean, did nature deceive us by making it look like the sun is in the orbit of the earth? No, we deceived ourselves. It was our own stupidity. The sun is the sun. It's doing what it does. It doesn't care what we think of it. And so I'm a naturalist in that sense. I think nature does what it does because it is what it is. It's not, nobody's trying to simulate or deceive, but the physical world is just an appearance. I think the world as it is in itself is not describable through numbers, through physical quantities. And I would argue that by interpreting the physical world this way, you would solve so many seemingly insoluble problems in foundations of physics today.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So I think what we should do now is turn to some of the slides that you've provided. I'm going to run the slideshow from my computer here. Okay, good. So I've got this queued up, and you should be able to see the slides over there. There we go. And I will let us go forth. Let's see if this will work. So can you still see the screen? Do you see it as full screen on YouTube, or do you
Yes.
see? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. So Essentia Foundation, Bernardo Kastrup at essentiafoundation.org. Okay. You see it says, "Is physics about an external?" You see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So take it away.
Okay. This was a presentation in which I tried to argue that physics would be um, easier to do and more productive, especially foundations of physics, if we did not make metaphysical assumptions and we stuck just to the data. One metaphysical assumption that is so common, most people don't even know that it's an assumption, is the assumption that the physical world is the world outside, that the world outside is exhaustively describable through physical quantities. And that's mistaking a representation for the thing in itself, potentially. All we have is perception. Perception is how the world presents itself to us. And physics is a science of perception. Physics asks the question, and I credit Dr. Marcus Miller for that. The question that physics asks is, what will I see next? That's the whole business of physics, is to predict what we will see next. Now, when you go and say those physical entities that I see and that I can characterize through numbers, they are the entities of the world out there as it is in itself, independent of my observation or my measurement. That's an enormous metaphysical assumption, and one that we can actually, in fact, dismiss, or not dismiss, but refute. And that's the contents of the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So is the physical world out there as it is in itself what it looks like to us? That's the question. If you go to the next slide. One line of argument to say that it cannot be was defended by Carl Friston already a few years ago, and it's based on the notion of entropy. Now, he uses very complex mathematics, which is difficult to follow. He uses the notion of Markov blankets, but to summarize it in a way that everybody can understand, the argument is the following: there is no upper bound, upper limit to the entropy of the states of the world out there. We cannot put an upper bound to that because it doesn't depend on us. It's nature. So for all we know, there is no upper bound to the dispersion of the states of the world. If we saw the world as it is in itself, that would mean that our inner cognitive states mirror the states of the world.
Mm.
That's what it means to see the world as it is. Our inner cognitive states mirror the states of the world. But then that would mean that there would be no upper bound to the dispersion of our inner cognitive states. There would be no upper bound to our internal entropy. And therefore, we cannot guarantee that we could maintain our structural and dynamical integrity just merely by looking at the world. By looking at the world, for all you know, you could melt into hot soup. But we have never seen that happen. We've never seen any living being melt into hot soup by the mere fact that it is observing the world. So, no, our inner cognitive states cannot mirror the states of the world. They are encoded inferential representations thereof, which then do put an upper bound to our internal entropy. That's one argument. And the next argument is evolutionary. We didn't evolve to see the world as it is. We evolved to see the world in whatever way helps us survive. To give you an example that Don Hoffman likes to use, when you look at a computer file on your computer or on your desktop, you don't see the file as it actually is. The file as it actually is are millions of open or closed microscopic electronic switches.
Right.
Now, if you saw the file as it actually is, that would be completely dysfunctional. You might as well throw the computer away. So you see a representation thereof in the form of a little colored rectangle on your computer desktop. That gives you accurate and actionable information about the file, but it doesn't tell you how, it doesn't present the file to you as it actually is. And the same would apply for perception. Nature would never evolve a cognitive apparatus that shows us the world as it is. It would give us a dashboard of dials, just like the dashboard of dials of an airplane, that sort of summarizes and conveys, gives us a summary of what is salient about the world in a way that does limit entropy. Like the scales of the dials are bound on both sides.
Mm.
And the variety of states of the dashboard is so bound that you can write an airplane manual telling you what to do for all kinds of combinations of dial indications. That's the physical world. It's our dashboard. We don't have a transparent windshield to see the world as it is. That would be deadly, and evolutionarily that would drive us to extinction swiftly, as game theory has shown.
Hmm.
And even our instruments don't overcome this dashboard paradigm because we still need to perceive the output of our instruments. Everything gets filtered through the dashboard. So if you go to the next one, in physics, there is this series of experiments. I don't need to get into details because it has won the Nobel Prize this year. So by now, everybody knows what this is. These experiments show us that physical properties are a result of measurement. We cannot speak of physical entities prior to a measurement or an observation. And the experiments go roughly as follows. They can be a lot more complicated than this, like quantum eraser experiments, but in a nutshell, you produce two particles together, so they are entangled, like two photons. And you shoot one photon to the left and one photon to the right. On the left, scientist Alice makes a measurement of photon A after it has covered a certain distance. And on the right, scientist Bob makes a measurement on photon B after it has covered a certain distance. And as it turns out, what Bob sees depends on what Alice chose to measure. In other words, the particles are not what they are prior to measurement. They acquire their physical properties. They become physical only in the moment they are measured, which takes some people for a spin. They think, well, if the particles are not physical, if there is no physicality, what is it that we measure? Woo, woo, woo. And then you go down the avenue that like Carlo Rovelli does, the
Right.
avenue of infinite regress. It's turtles all the way down. Rovelli says it's
Mhm.
relations all the way down. If you go back to the previous slide, just for me to cover that very quickly, it's much easier to understand this if we realize that physicality is not the world as it is in itself. Physicality is the results of measurements, just like what the dials show on the dashboard of an airplane is the result of a measurement. If the airplane sensors don't make any measurements, the dials show nothing. There's
Mm.
nothing on the dashboard.
Right.
Does that mean that there is no world? Of course not. The world that is measured doesn't care whether you measure it or not, it's still there. But physicality is the dashboard. So if you don't measure, yes, then the dashboard shows nothing.
Mm.
Without measurement, there is no physical world. The world as it is in itself is not describable through physical quantities. That's all the experiment is telling. And it lines up with the argument of Carl Friston, the argument of Donald Hoffman. And we can go further in the next slide. We can understand why there is such a tight correlation between Alice's choice and Bob's measurement, even though Alice and Bob cannot communicate. And this is experiment has excluded that possibility. The choice of measurement is made after the particles are in flight. So in the previous slide, still, Brian, very quickly,
Yep.
how can you understand that? Well,
Mhm.
imagine that you're watching a soccer game at home on two television screens because you are such a big soccer fan, and you're watching them in two different through two different broadcasters, and each broadcaster has their own cameras on the stadium. So the images will be different on the two televisions, but they will be entirely correlated. Now, if a 19th century traveler were sitting next to you, the traveler would be amazed. How do the little man running inside the box on the left know how to coordinate their movements with the little man running inside the box to the right? Why does your 19th century guy become confused? Because he thinks the images are the thing in itself. He thinks the football match is the image on the TV, that the little men are inside the TV. Now we know that the TV shows images, representations. The real thing is the football stadium. It's far away. And the images are correlated because they are both different representations of the same underlying reality. And the way we should regard these quantum entanglement experiments is exactly like that. Physicality is an image, just like the television screen. That's why what Bob sees correlates tightly with what Alice sees, even though they cannot communicate at all. And there is no causal link between the two, because physicality is an image. Physicality is not the soccer match, it's the television image. And the problem disappears, but we are 21st century people seeing 21st century evidence, but thinking like 19th century people. That's where it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So the next one. So to summarize this, and I think we are close to the
Yeah.
point where you want to stop it,
Mm-hmm.
just to bring in some technical concepts. Uh, our inner cognitive states, that's a set of states that represented by the letter R. And the world outside is another set of states, independent of our inner states, that's represented by the letter psi. So we interact with the world, our inner states interact with the states of the world through some sensory states, what we perceive, and some action states, how we uh, act in the world, merely by existing and displacing a volume of air. Those are the A states, and the sensory states are the S states. And there are these causal links across all of them. And mathematically, you can model the sensory and active states as a Markov blanket. And there's a whole set of mathematical tooling that you get when you model things this way. And I think the way we can model what's going on is to understand that the set of states psi that constitute the world out there, the objective world, objective nature as it is in itself, those states are not physical states. Physical states are the A's and S's. The physical world is a Markov blanket that surrounds different living beings. That's why physics is relational. And there, Carlo Rovelli is right. Physics is relational because each one of us has its own physical world as this sort of layered set of Markov Blankian states that allows us to interact with the real world. Now, we all share the real world. There is only one real world that we inhabit, and those are the states psi. But they are not physical. Physical states are relational. That's what I try to show in this slide. And if you regard the problems in foundations of physics today through these lenses, many of the seemingly impossible contradictions and um, seemingly insoluble problems, they suddenly become treatable. I don't claim that they are solved through this. No, no. The
Right.
measurement problem is not so trivially solvable, but at least they become treatable. There is a way to think about them that is coherent.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So, shall we take some questions now, Bernardo?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Let me go back to here. Good. So we have over 100 people, as I said, watching so far. There's been close to 500 people that have come in and out of the chat room. So let's start going here. The first one has to do with, and by the way, you can always ask questions, as I said, on Twitter, Dr. Brian Keating, or on the YouTube channel itself. I solicit those before my guests come on. First one comes from Casper Ablidge, who asked, what does Bernardo think about quantum gravity theories? Maybe I can just slightly tweak that and say, what do you think of ORC-OR, the theory that somehow the wild curvature tensor and gravitational forces cause consciousness to occur?
So these are two completely different questions. You know that. So first, ORC-OR. I think it's false. And my criticism of it is it's not original, but I think it's valid, which is that consciousness seems mysterious. Collapse seems mysterious. Oh, they might have something to do with one another. Well, I don't think nature works like this. I don't think that's how we should go about theory. I have great respect for Sir Roger. I think the Nobel Prize in Physics last year was more than deserved. He should have earned it before, but he didn't earn it for ORC-OR. He earned it for something else.
Of course.
I don't think consciousness causes collapse. I don't think consciousness has this magical power of changing the states of the world as it is in itself. I think the very question disappears if you regard foundations of physics through the lens I just explained in the slides we just went through. And then the whole issue about collapse, that whole thing disappears, and we will adopt a kind of almost a cubist approach to things. The wave function is not the world as it is, it's our knowledge of the world. It's our best betting strategy.
Very
And
good.
you see, that's how I would regard it.
Yeah.
Now, loop quantum gravity, that's something completely else. There I am more optimistic. Before it, all we had was uh, M theory, and M theory. To say that it's over-determining is the is a how to say it doesn't even approach the seriousness of the issue. Um, and loop quantum gravity gives us at least a handle on what I think will very soon be the greatest mystery of the 21st century. Consciousness is not it. I think we have the solutions there. It's a matter of people getting used to it. It's a matter of the prejudices slowly melting under the sun of reason, like
Mhm.
butter. It takes a while. It's not instantaneous, but it's going
Right.
to happen. I think the greatest mystery of the 21st century is time, because time is discombobulating. It's obviously there, and it's obviously not there.
Mm.
Uh, um, and loop quantum gravity may give us a handle on at least the beginning of a handle, beginning of a mathematized way of regarding it. And so there I'm more optimistic about loop
Very
quantum gravity. Yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Craig Sadler is asking, what does Dr. Kastrup have to say about the hypothesis or hypotheses like predictive coding and active inference, which mean that perception is primarily a brain-generated construct appearing in awareness?
Well, that's not what those hypotheses say, because the brain is an object of perception. So for you to be coherent, you have to regard the brain as an actively inferential modality of perception. In other words, the brain as cannot be taken uncritically as a thing in itself. The brain, too, as a content of perception, is inferentially constructed. It's a coded representation
Mm.
of our cognitive system. Um, that hypothesis does not reduce to materialism. It does not say that the contents of perception as experiences, the quality of perception, are reducible to the brain. All that it says is that all the quality of perception, including the brains we see, including the EEG curves we measure, all of that is an encoded inferential cognitive representation produced by our cognitive system. The brain itself is one of those inferences. So if you to be internally consistent with one's hypothesis, you have to apply coded inferential cognition to that very object we call brain and brain activity. Otherwise, it's incoherent.
Mhm. Very good. Okay, so let's see. The next question. Let's see. Let me fast forward a bunch. There's so many good questions here. Is consciousness fractal? Is there a fractal relationship, or maybe this has to do more with the brain? I don't know. You can interpret that any way you like. Then I'll
I
have
think the contents of consciousness uh, may largely be fractal. Um, Let me be more generic here.
Mhm.
I don't know whether the whole of nature is fractal. Large segments of it are, and fractals have a rather uncanny applicability. Even in game development,
Mm.
by using fractals, you can construct very convincing artificial landscapes, which sort of raises the question, might nature not be doing the same thing? I don't know whether nature is fractal, but I would say the following more generically. Um, I'm a naturalist and a reductionist, so let me put the cards of my prejudices on the table up front in an attempt to be as honest as possible. I think that the key challenge is the following. We can write the fundamental equations of physics, which is the queen of sciences. We can write all the fundamental equations of physics on half a page.
Mhm.
In other words, and although there may be more sophisticated organizing principles that kick in at macroscopic levels and therefore cannot be isolated under laboratory conditions, you cannot control the variables in a laboratory condition. So we may be blind to them. They may exist, we may be blind to them. So maybe it's a full page, not half a page.
Mhm.
But uh, there aren't many of these organizing principles. And then that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the universe is exquisitely complex
Hmm.
and varied. I mean, the variety of phenomena between the microscopic and the macroscopic in nature is just mind-boggling. So how do you reconcile these two things? How can there be so few, so simple organizing principles that
Hmm.
lead to this massive complexity? And I think what this seems to indicate is that whether fractal or not, nature works through an iterative application of self-similar rules.
Hmm.
Fractals are an instance of that. But
Yes.
cellular automata are another instance of that. And you can create a cellular automaton based on one or two very simple rules, and it produces magnificent complexity,
Hmm.
magnificent variety. So because of these two observations, the obvious complexity of nature and the obvious simplicity of nature's organizing principles, I think we will have to come to some kind of iterative self-similar application of principles, so an iterative rule that applies itself to its own results again and again and again and again to produce the complexity of nature. And a fractal is just one possibility in that direction.
Very good. Okay, I'll take a couple more questions here before it's getting super late over there, and I have a meeting to get to in a few
Okay.
minutes too. So,
Okay.
this question comes from Anton SH. What problem is philosophy of consciousness trying to tackle? Is it related to some prediction of the future, as with science, as it is with science, or something else which we can't possibly fully verbalize? So, I guess what is the really zeitgeist of this field?
Well, the key motivation, the field began under the materialist zeitgeist, under the materialist ethos,
Mm-hmm.
which is that our mental life somehow should be reducible to material brain activity, and material entities have standalone existence. They are not the outcome of measurement. They are not epiphenomenal. They are the thing in itself, and our thoughts, our conscious activity somehow arises from that. But there has never been an explicit and sufficient account for that, not even vaguely sufficient. So philosophy of mind comes in and tries to ask the question, okay, what is consciousness then? How does it come to be? What role does it play? Is consciousness merely a witness, or is it part of the causal nexus? These are all the open questions, and they arise fundamentally, they are motivated fundamentally by this assumption that physicality precedes phenomenality in
Mm-hmm.
nature, ontologically, that the phenomenal arises from the physical, which leads to all these questions. So that's the motivation for the discipline. Once it becomes commonplace and accepted that consciousness as a nontic category is fundamental, it's what there is, everything else arises from it, then you could argue that the very field of philosophy of mind will end, because it's asking questions for which we have answers now. We didn't explain consciousness, but we explained everything else in terms of consciousness, which is just as good or even better. And then the field would disappear, and all there will be is the neuroscience of the contents of consciousness.
Mm.
That will always be relevant.
Very good. Okay, last question I'll take before we wrap up and let Bernardo get some slumber, and before he gets mad at me and says the insult that I've received from many Dutchmen, which is that I appear to be cluff in the molen. Cluff in the molen. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, okay, okay.
Hit in the head with a windmill. Okay, so Kishkashta, what is your take on Tom Campbell's theory that the universe is more virtual reality?
Depends on what he means by virtual reality. I had a conversation with him some time
Mm,
ago, and we agreed on a great number of things. So I think what he calls a virtual reality is what I call the dashboard, and so we might actually be in agreement.
you might be. That's great. Well, Bernardo, it's been such a treat. I want to again thank my good friend Kurt J. Mungle, who is responsible for connecting us. On his channel is a model for mine and has helped me out so much. I want to thank all the viewers. Hundreds have watched it so far. We'll rebroadcast it. We'll post it, repost it with some light editing in just a bit. And as a reminder, you can always follow Bernardo and myself on Twitter. Brian, the two BKs that should be prominent in your mind. the Bernardo Kastrup at Twitter, and I'm Dr. Brian Keating at Twitter. And don't forget to leave a comment on the video, thumbs up if you liked it. If you want to have more conversations, maybe we'll do a part 2. If you'd like to see maybe just a free-for-all with Don Hoffman. I'm serious about this, Bernard. I'd like to have you, Don Hoffman, Sabina, and also Philip Goff on. But do you think that would be productive, or do you think we'd kind of just devolve into a shouting
Me
match?
and Don, we would just agree. So
Okay. All right, so
boring.
you're redundant. Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, we'll figure it out. Anyway, I want to thank everybody. Do subscribe to my mailing list if you want to receive a piece of real, honest to good space schmutz. And this is actually a peanut, I think. But I do have some unconscious or maybe panpsychic meteorite material. So that's at briankeating.com/list. You can find it there. We have great interviews coming up on Tuesday. We are featuring none other than Francis Halzen, who is the Bright professor he's a Belgian physicist by training, and he runs the ice cube experiment. And we had a wonderful conversation about the impact of new ice cube measurements, Bernardo. I don't know if you heard this, on quantum gravity and constraining quantum gravity with neutrinos, which is quite fascinating. And I know you'll enjoy that, and others will as well. And I just want to thank Bernardo so much for coming on the show. And again, leave a comment if you want to see a mashup with a bunch of scientists talking about consciousness in a debate form. Maybe we can make that happen. For now, I want to thank you all, and I want to bid you a good night and a good weekend over there, Bernardo. Get some schluff. It is late there, but I really appreciate this. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too. Good night.
Take care. Bye.